The SOS reached the galaxy's deadliest species, and the fleet deployed. The forward basalt wall of the obsidian spire split open without a sound. No fire, no sound, no light. A thick block of dark stone simply vanished into the vacuum, leaving a perfectly smooth hole where the command tier used to join the secondary shield battery. High Admiral Vorant locked his lower two scaled arms around the heavy command console to stop his 7-foot frame from pulling toward the decompression breach. The automated magnetic seal dropped over the rupture with a sharp hiss, but the deck continued to tilt. The Grand Theater smelled of sharp ozone, ionized fuel, and the heavy leather of dead officers. The Keltari hegemony had taken 84 star systems through kinetic siege, but they had never encountered a weapon that didn't leave heat signs. Vorant stared through the central viewport at the fleet deployed against him. A cluster of matte black, unshielded hulls moved through the burning remains of the Vali planetary network with heavy momentum. When the SOS first reached the Dark Zone, the Galactic Council had formally rescinded their defense pact, classifying the outer sector as a lost liability to avoid a war. The Council always chose cowardice when the math favored the executioner, leaving the Vali people to face total cleansing alone. Vorant had budgeted exactly 72 hours to turn the local crystal platforms into drifting glass shrapnel, assuming the galaxy's deadliest species would remain behind their 300-year-old cordon. He had operated on perfect logic, but the unshielded iron ships closing the distance were not running standard tactical lines. Would you have broken 3 centuries of safety for an unknown frequency? Because she didn't hesitate. Let us look closer at the log. 12 hours before the basalt wall cracked, Commander Sarah Vance sat inside the primary interface room of Gantry 12, slowly winding an antique silver pocket watch. The orbital station smelled of recycled air and the mineral bite of ion-filtered light. Vance was 56, her short hair gray at the temples, with a thin white scar running from her left cheekbone down to her collar. She did not look at the main tactical display until the console chimed with a low, rhythmic pulse that had not been recorded since the cordon was first established. Dr. Ellen Choi isolated the incoming wave, her ink-stained fingers freezing over the interface. Commander, we have an unrestricted cross-sector breach coming from outside the system boundary. The Keltari Vanguard has broken the orbital lines of the Vali homeworld. Vance stopped winding. The click of the watch mechanism locking was the loudest sound in the room. She did not call a regional staff meeting or request authorization from the civilian oversight boards. Verify the population metrics, she said calmly, her voice level and flat against the hum of the air scrubbers. Lieutenant Marcus Boyd checked the logistics ledger on his tablet, his steel stylus scratching against the glass. The incoming tally confirms 14 million noncombatants pinned below the primary bombardment line. The Council Navy executed a full retreat 3 hours ago. The Vali are entirely isolated. Vance looked down at the silver casing in her palm, snapped the metal cover shut, and slipped it into her worn wool coat. 300 years of silence, and they finally gave Earth a reason to look out the window. Activate the Iron Cradle Protocol, she ordered. Across the inner belt, the massive magnetic assembly tracks inside the hollowed-out cores of 4 moons began to slide. For 3 centuries, humanity had allowed the alien empires to believe they were primitive, isolationist, or terrified of deep space politics. The Council had modeled human behavior based on their own rules of engagement, assuming a species that does not expand is a species that cannot project power. They did not know that the human fleet had spent those centuries building a standardized logistics framework designed entirely for an all-out emergency. 87 Capital-class assault vectors decoupled from the Jovian gravity wells within 12 hours of the initial broadcast. They carried no flags, no bright heraldry, and no decorative markers on their matte black composite hulls. There were no grand speeches broadcast to the cities on Earth, and no victory parades followed them into the dark. They moved under continuous acceleration, flanked by 1,200 automated supply tenders that carried 3 million tons of kinetic munitions into the slipstream corridors. At the Vali perimeter, the sensor array on the obsidian spire registered the sudden gravitational distortion. Vorant watched the primitive heat signatures populate his tracking display. His subcommander reported that the approaching vessels completely lacked energy shielding or plasma arrays, relying on heavy internal combustion machinery and raw iron-nickel hulls. Vorant let out a low, vibrating click of amusement from his upper mandibles. They bring unshielded iron to a plasma engagement. They are fighting with tools from the previous epoch. Let them advance into the primary kill zone. He was acting on perfect military doctrine. According to every tactical manual in galactic history, an unshielded armada entering an established orbital blockade was suicide. He did not know that the human ships lacked shields because their structures were reinforced with 6 meters of high-density composite matrix designed to absorb and vaporize thermal loads through ablative cooling. He did not know they had spent 300 years perfecting a single method of mechanical delivery. The human fleet did not drop out of warp in a defensive wedge. They arrived at full tactical velocity, using their automated tenders as physical thermal sinks to mask their primary approach vectors. On the bridge of the Terran flagship, Vance stood without holding the reinforcement rails as the structural frame shuddered through the transition. "Target their primary engine clusters," she commanded over the fleet loop. "Do not clear the comms channels. Let them listen to the tracking computers." The Keltari Vanguard fired their forward plasma lances, striking the lead human vessels with superheated energy loops. The ablative hull screamed, shedding white-hot sheets of composite material into the dark, but the ships kept coming through the wash. They did not slow down to recalibrate their vectors. At 5,000 kilometers, the Terran vessels opened their forward launch tubes, releasing 30-ton bars of depleted uranium traveling at a significant fraction of light speed. Vorant watched his flagship's forward particle shields collapse under the sheer mechanical impact of the first 3 volleys. The kinetic energy did not dissipate. It transferred directly into the vessel's basalt bulkheads, snapping structural iron joints and buckling the polished stone floors. The sensory architecture of his power was literally cracking around him. The unencrypted Terran radio bands filled the Keltari command room, a cold, rhythmic callout of coordinates and casualty assessments, replacing all military dialogue. They did not turn, they did not answer, they did not stop. The remaining Keltari ships attempted to adjust their lines for a strategic withdrawal, but the continuous acceleration loops of the Terran vessels cut off their drift brakes. 3 more uranium rods sheared directly through the core of the obsidian spire, severing the fuel lines to the secondary reactors. Vorant dropped to his knees on his ruined bridge, his lower arms clutching the fractured console as the decompression alarms began to wail through the smoke. He managed to force an emergency transmission through to the lead human vessel. "Why?" he demanded, his voice breaking as the internal pressure dropped. "You are not part of the Council. You have no stakes in this sector. Why deploy your entire civilization's military asset for a race you do not know?" The response did not come from an automated translation program. It came from Vance, her voice clear, steady, and utterly devoid of triumph over the open channel. "We didn't answer the call to join your council," Vance said, her thumb tracing the smooth edge of her pocket watch as the gear network ticked behind the metal face. "We answered the call to end your war." The transmission ended with a flat electronic snap. Through the viewport of the high viewing galley, Sheila watched the 316 surviving Keltari vessels turn away from the planet, their engines misfiring through structural breaches as they fled toward the southern arm. The Terran armada did not pursue them. They adjusted their vectors to form an orbital perimeter around the surviving Vali cities, their dark hulls blocking the cold glare of the local star. On Gantry 12, the primary tactical display updated its sector registries in the quiet room. The old cordon marker disappeared from the grid, replaced by a single white designation that flashed against the dark. The terminal screen held the new notation steady, showing the sector was no longer a dark zone. The word faced up, active.